The Battle Between Truth and Relativism, a philosophical deep dive. Today, I would like to explore the concept of truth, along with some of the challenges it faces. By the conclusion of this discussion, I will touch upon the philosophical views of Richard Rorty, who is well known for his assertion that only a metaphysical prig would still believe in truth. I must admit, I find myself somewhat of a prig, despite having authored a book on desire. My main point is that it is entirely possible to hold a belief in truth without being a metaphysical prig. You simply need to embrace a certain level of priggishness. This will serve as the backdrop for our conversation. I won't be reading from my book on truth in its entirety, but I will provide a summary that leads us to Rorty's ideas. The discussion of truth is not new. It has been a topic of debate for centuries. For instance, in the dialogue known as Theaetetus, we encounter a clash between relativists and absolutists. The relativist often comes across as somewhat disdainful, suggesting that much of our discourse surrounding truth, objectivity, and knowledge, perhaps even scientific rationality, is merely a facade. They argue that such discussions are often just a means to persuade others to adopt our viewpoints, implying that the primary function of these terms is tied to power dynamics and persuasion. I sometimes refer to this perspective as a postmodernist viewpoint, which is a label I find relatively harmless, although one could certainly debate whether specific postmodernists fit neatly into this characterization. In contrast to the relativists, we have the absolutists, who assert that truth is a divine entity deserving of reverence. For them, truth is real, it is absolute, and it demands our worship. To stray from truth is seen as a significant failure, and it imposes a moral obligation upon us. In the dialogues, Socrates often embodies the absolutist stance, championing the idea of truth, while he engages with figures like Theodorus and Protagoras, who represent the opposing view. In essence, we have two distinct camps. On one side, the philosophers who believe that truth merits respect and dignity, akin to a royal figure, and on the other side, the relativists who view discussions of truth as akin to donning theatrical costumes or masks. I believe that both sides often miss the mark in their arguments, as they tend to talk past one another. Much of the discourse on either side fails to address the core issues at hand. To illustrate this point, I would like to share a story that I have previously published in my book, A Being Good. For those of you in the audience who may have read it, I apologize for the repetition, but I think it effectively demonstrates how the two sides can misunderstand each other. This true story involves my friend, the esteemed philosopher Jeremy Waldron, who was participating in a think tank at Princeton focused on ethics. During this time, he encountered a situation that perfectly encapsulates the disconnect between the relativist and absolutist perspectives. Jeremy's fellowship at the Institute came with a requirement to attend all the talks hosted by the institution. One evening, the Institute organized an event open to the broader university community and the public, a panel discussion featuring representatives of major world religions. Though Jeremy had no particular interest in the topic, he attended out of obligation. The event unfolded with each speaker explaining their tradition's core beliefs. First, a Hindu representative discussed karma, the cycle of reincarnation, and the journey through multiple lifetimes toward liberation. The audience responded warmly, applauding and saying, "That sounds meaningful for you." Next, a Buddhist speaker outlined the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path as ways to overcome suffering caused by desire. Again, the crowd cheered, echoing the same supportive sentiment. When a Catholic priest took the floor, he described humanity's fall from grace in Eden, the role of the serpent, and salvation through Jesus Christ. The audience, maintaining their earlier tone, praised his words but added, "If that works for you." Only for the priest to interrupt emphatically. He insisted this wasn't merely a personal belief but the absolute truth, warning that disbelief led to damnation. The room fell silent, highlighting how the participants had been speaking past one another all along. The ancient Greek concept of giving with the right hand and receiving with the left perfectly captured this disconnect, ideas were exchanged, but understanding remained elusive. This raises a deeper question. How can we resolve such disagreements? Recent philosophical approaches to truth, particularly minimalism or deflationism, offer intriguing solutions. Thinkers like Stephen Leeds and Paul Horwich argue that truth isn't a grand metaphysical concept but a practical tool. For instance, if someone asks, like Pontius Pilate, "What is truth?" the minimalist responds by asking, "What specific truth are you curious about?" If the person says, "Do penguins fly?" the minimalist answers, "The truth here is that penguins fly." While this might seem anticlimactic, the point is that truth functions as a linguistic shortcut rather than a profound mystery. By focusing on concrete examples, deflationism sidesteps abstract debates, treating truth as a label we apply to statements we agree with, no more, no less. This approach avoids endless philosophical tangents and keeps discussions grounded in shared context. When it comes to seeking answers, the minimalist perspective suggests that we should focus solely on the specific question at hand, without elevating ourselves to a lofty, abstract plane. In other words, we're not adopting a God's eye view or an Archimedean point outside the issue. For instance, if someone asks, "Do penguins fly?" the inquiry is straightforward and empirical. It's about gathering facts, not engaging in metaphysical speculation. This approach has significant implications. It means that when we discuss truth, we're dealing with concrete, observable matters rather than abstract, theoretical constructs. Consider the example of wanting to know whether penguins fly. This is a clear-cut question that can be answered through observation, research, or consultation of reliable sources like encyclopedias. There's no need to invoke grand philosophical stances or privileged viewpoints. The minimalist argues that the issue itself is the focus, and any attempt to introduce broader theoretical concerns is a distraction. This perspective contrasts with both absolutist and relativist views, which often seek to create space for overarching theories about truth. The minimalist stance, also known as deflationism, is sometimes criticized for seemingly diminishing the value or importance of truth. Critics argue that it undermines the idea that truth is intrinsically valuable or worth caring about. For example, characters like Winston in George Orwell's Star 1984 or the moral stance of Primo Levi demonstrate a deep commitment to truth, even at great personal cost. The question arises, how can truth remain an ideal if it's reduced to a matter of empirical inquiry? However, this challenge is not insurmountable. The minimalist responds by emphasizing that caring about truth is directly tied to caring about specific issues. If you're concerned about whether penguins waddle, for instance, you're inherently caring about the truth of that statement. This care extends to related matters, such as ensuring that your statements about penguins are accurate or believing claims about their behavior only if they are true. In essence, the minimalist provides a framework for understanding how we care about truth in a grounded, issue-specific way, without needing to appeal to abstract, robust properties of truth. This approach allows truth to remain a meaningful ideal, rooted in our engagement with concrete questions and their answers. The concept of caring about satisfying a particular belief schema can be quite intricate. To put it simply, one might believe in a proposition P if and only if they can affirm P as true a significant number of times. Alternatively, an individual may experience guilt when they find themselves in a situation where they believe in P, even though P is not actually true. This could also manifest as a willingness to exert considerable effort to maximize either the frequency or the number of instances in which they can affirm that belief schema. It's important to note that the schema itself does not inherently reference the notion of truth. Therefore, one does not require a strong metaphysical understanding of truth to grasp the concerns raised by figures like Winston or Primo Levi. While it is accurate that minimalism may strip away one's right to prioritize truth as one ideally should, it raises an interesting question. Does this minimalist perspective compel relativists to retreat into silence? In other words, Does this line of thinking effectively challenge any relativistic tendencies one might hold? I believe it does, particularly when it comes to what is sometimes referred to as the naive or simplistic moral relativist, the kind you might encounter in everyday discussions or in a freshman seminar setting. To illustrate this, let's consider a moral dilemma, such as the debate over whether fox hunting should be prohibited. This topic has been a significant point of contention in Britain recently. Imagine two individuals engaged in this debate. One, whom we'll call Genghis, advocates for the continuation of fox hunting, while I argue for its ban. Now, picture a relativist named Rosie entering the conversation. She might interject with a statement like, "You two are always arguing about this issue as if there is an objective truth to it. You need to understand that, for you, Simon, it is true that fox hunting should be banned, while for Genghis, it is true that it should not be banned. This is your truth and his truth, so why not just agree to disagree?" However, I contend that minimalism effectively counters Rose's argument. It does so by rendering the concept of my truth and your truth meaningless, except in the context of stating that I believe fox hunting should be banned and Genghis believes it should not. We already recognize these opposing views, which is precisely why we are engaged in a debate. By silencing Rosie, minimalism highlights her role as a distraction. After she presents her perspective, what is supposed to happen? Are we expected to simply concede and say, "All right, let's agree to disagree"? Of course not. If I were to agree to differ with Genghis, it would essentially mean tolerating fox hunting, which is contrary to my stance. So, why should I alter my viewpoint or begin to accept fox hunting simply because of anything Rosie has said? Her comments do not provide any justification for making fox hunting more acceptable. She has not changed the colors in which it might appear to me, nor has she engaged with any reasons I might have for thinking that fox hunting ought to be banned. She has also not engaged with any reasons Genghis might have for thinking it ought not to. In other words, her contribution seems to be just a distraction. I don't think that's always the case. A contribution of that kind may not be a distraction if there's not a real issue, or if the two protagonists sought to stop bickering for some other reason. Most likely, they haven't framed an issue properly. I think many issues about values are not framed properly, such as when you and I go to the art gallery and say Rembrandt is a greater painter than Vermeer, and you respond by saying no. There may be a point in someone trying to stop us from bickering by putting the issue into terms like, which is the greater painter? However, discussing all sorts of issues related to the relationship between Rembrandt and Vermeer can still be useful. But if we instead frame the issue based solely on who is considered the greater painter, we won't get anywhere. Without clear definitions, we won't identify an issue worth discussing and therefore not an issue worth bickering about. Therefore, I don't think relativism is always a distraction or merely a distraction, but I believe in cases where an issue needs to be resolved, the motto is the issue is the issue. These remarks purporting to be about the nature of truth are irrelevant and distractions. What about, though, the movement of modern thought, postmodernism? You may think it's unlikely to be silenced by the kinds of remarks I've made. Minimalism about truth gets us further, but the climate of postmodernism, as it were, what I vaguely pointed to as postmodernism, is one that we're not going to change simply by insisting upon it. I think the postmodernist climate can best be summarized by stating that I quite like her. A few years ago, there was a very indiscernible and talkative butler man named Paul Burrell, who served as Princess Diana's butler and had been involved in leaking information to newspapers for considerable sums. He said apropos of Diana's death that the Queen had told him there are dark forces at work, which we know nothing about. Well, I rather die regardless of whether the Queen said anything like that. But if she did, then she's essentially giving us a motto of postmodernism, because I think the motivation behind the steam, truth, behind much of what we read about the decline of truth or the absence of objectivity is what drives us forward. This process of acculturation inevitably leads us to perceptions shaped by a shared experience, whose effects on us we cannot dismiss, for we cannot step outside our own skins. The biases we carry, shaped by our interests, vocabulary, and perspectives, influence how we perceive the world. It's a misconception to think that postmodernism is solely the domain of eccentric continental philosophers, a notion that some graduate students in this room might mistakenly believe. In reality, postmodernism is also deeply rooted in Anglo-American culture. For instance, if we envision a Garden of Eden or a Golden Age, we might think of a time when positivism was at its peak. However, this historical view is overly simplistic. A golden age would imply a clear and definitive experience, a structured approach to understanding that experience to formulate theories. While it may not provide a strict algorithm for theory creation, it would at least offer rational methods for evaluating those theories, along with a clear meaning that allows us to communicate our findings without distortion. If we picture this scenario, we might also consider other essential elements, such as dependable logic and a priori certainty. In this context, we can observe that the developments in post-war analytic or Anglo-American philosophy, which often received specific labels, effectively dismantled that optimistic vision. In other words, our expulsion from this metaphorical paradise was complete. Think of philosophers like Selous, who challenged the myth of a given, questioning the assumption that observation could directly connect us to the facts we observe. Quinn further eroded the idea of meaning being fixed, suggesting that the words we use do not necessarily convey a stable meaning that we can reliably share with others. Additionally, Wittgenstein emphasized the importance of human nature, and perhaps cultural influences, in shaping our understanding of what is happening around us. This abstract interpretation aligns with Wittgenstein's rule-following considerations, which resonate with Goodman's thoughts as well. Eventually, we encounter Thomas Kuhn, who argued that science is less about rationality and more about viewing natural phenomena through specific paradigms, which can shift. These shifts are influenced by various social, political, and other underlying forces, altering the concepts we use to understand nature. When we consider these perspectives collectively, we can see a common thread. They all contribute to undermining the bright epistemological picture that the positivists were perhaps the last to uphold. Against this backdrop, we can better understand some of the more radical ideas presented by Richard Rorty, who is often seen as a representative of the postmodernist perspective. Rorty tends to downplay the concept of truth, suggesting that successful discourse is more about coping with situations rather than merely copying reality. He implies that the idea of representation is somehow transcendental, indicating a shift in how we think about truth and knowledge. The concept of language as a means of representing facts often feels elusive. The philosopher frequently poses the question of whether one loves the truth, equating it to the question of whether one loves God wholeheartedly. This is a profound inquiry, one that does not lend itself to a straightforward answer, and thus, it may not be the most productive question to ask. This line of thought is part of his broader effort to shift away from traditional notions of representation and truth, advocating instead for a more Darwinian perspective that emphasizes adaptation. In this framework, discourse is evaluated not primarily on its truthfulness or falsity, but rather on its utility. Politically, this perspective also raises the question of whether a particular discourse fosters solidarity and consensus among individuals, as opposed to serving a different agenda. The notion of royalty emerges as a response to the pressures I have just outlined. This philosophical stance seems to arise from a sense of despair regarding the pursuit of epistemology. Thinkers like Selous and Wittgenstein, among many others, have contributed to this feeling of hopelessness surrounding the project of epistemological justification. In the remainder of my discussion, I aim to connect the ideas of minimalism with the insights I have shared, hoping to position royalty within a post-epistemological context. This context acknowledges the genuine challenges posed by the influential figures I have mentioned. On one hand, I find myself sympathetic to Rorty's approach, as he grapples with the issues left unresolved by philosophers like Cripp, Selous, and Wittgenstein. He takes their concerns seriously and seeks to navigate the epistemological deadlock they have created by effectively rejecting the subject of epistemology itself, which he does by questioning the concept of representation. This approach appears to be a thoughtful and constructive move. However, on the other hand, Rorty seems to undermine his own position by dismissing the notion of truth, suggesting that truth is a concept that only belongs to metaphysical discussions. He also appears to overlook the significance of Winston's struggles in George Orwell's 1984, implying that Winston's concerns about the party's manipulation of truth are unfounded. From my perspective, minimalism should prevent Rorty from making such claims. As I previously explained, minimalism provides a coherent understanding of Winston's situation, making the question of whether he loves the truth entirely reasonable. Therefore, it is puzzling why one would choose to align with Rorty's perspective, even when attempting to express sympathy for the anti-epistemological sentiments that undoubtedly influence his work. To illustrate this point, let me share a statement that reflects Rorty's views on the distinction between coping and copying. He asserts that there is no way. Let's consider how various tools, broadly defined, can potentially disconnect us from a direct engagement with reality. This isn't limited to physical implements like a hammer or a gun. It extends to abstract constructs such as a deeply held belief or even a simple statement. Using any tool is fundamentally an organism's way of interacting with its surrounding environment. Now, if we view the use of words not as an attempt to accurately mirror or represent the inherent nature of that environment, but rather as just another type of tool employed to navigate and deal with the world around us, then we are essentially dismissing a classic philosophical question. Are human minds truly in touch with reality? This is the very question that preoccupies the epistemological skeptic, someone who doubts our ability to know reality as it truly is. Here's where things get particularly interesting and, frankly, quite provocative. From this perspective, no organism, whether human or non-human, is inherently more or less in touch with reality than any other. Now, saying that out loud, especially perhaps while observing the diverse behaviors of people around you in a place like a coffee shop, might seem counterintuitive. You might be tempted to point to individuals who appear, at least on the surface, to be quite disconnected from what most of us would consider reality. However, you can start to see the line of reasoning that leads a philosopher like Richard Rorty to make such a bold claim. His argument stems from the idea that traditional epistemology, the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge and its relationship to reality, often leads us down unproductive paths, what some might metaphorically call crime cellars or an impasse, much like the difficulties encountered by thinkers such as Wittgenstein. For Rorty, it's a dead end, a non-starter that we can't really make progress with. So, he suggests we should abandon the whole notion of representation, the idea that our thoughts or words somehow picture or correspond to an external reality, which epistemologists are constantly trying to validate or certify. Instead, Rorty proposes we adopt a more pragmatic, almost Darwinian view of words. Think of language not as a mirror reflecting reality, but as a set of tools we've developed to help us cope, to survive, and to interact effectively within our environment and with each other. By making this conceptual shift, we can, in Rorty's view, leap free from the complex and often intractable problems that have plagued traditional philosophy for centuries. He likes to describe this move as simply changing the subject. Consequently, Rorty deliberately steps away from many of the traditional philosophical problems and discards a significant portion of the associated vocabulary, including fundamental terms like truth. He advocates for replacing the focus on representation with a different kind of framework, one centered around solidarity. According to this view, we gain the best understanding of what knowledge is when we see it as the result of the social justification of belief. In other words, a belief counts as knowledge not because it accurately represents reality, but because it is accepted and supported within a community through shared reasoning and discussion. This means we shouldn't be looking for vertical connections, a direct link or correspondence between our language, or ourselves as language users, and the external world. Instead, our focus should be on horizontal or inferential processes. These are the ways we interact with each other, offering reasons for our beliefs and accepting or challenging the reasons provided by others. Justification, then, becomes fundamentally a social activity, something that happens between people, rather than a private transaction between an isolated knowing subject and an independent reality. Recognizing this also means understanding that the norms, or rules, that govern how we make inferences and justify our beliefs are not universal or timeless. They are contingently and historically situated, meaning they depend entirely on the specific time, place, and cultural context we find ourselves in. These norms are essentially what our peers, the people in our community, let us get away with in terms of acceptable reasoning. So, the inferences and conclusions we draw are inherently ours, belonging to our community and as shared practices. They don't answer to, or get validated by, some external world, except in the very broad sense that they must ultimately help us and our community cope with our environment. It's almost a foregone conclusion that a language and its associated inferential practices will enable coping. If they didn't, the community using them would likely go to the wall, meaning they would fail or cease to exist, and the language wouldn't be used anymore. This line of thinking is what leads Rorty to make some of his more striking and, for many, controversial assertions, such as the famous claim that truth is what your contemporaries let you get away with. This particular remark, for instance, famously provoked considerable anger from philosopher Hilary Putnam. As Putnam rightly pointed out, there seems to be more than just a hint of self-refutation in that statement itself, given that Rorty's contemporaries certainly didn't let him get away with that specific remark. It was widely debated and criticized. Ultimately, for many observers, Rorty's proposed solution to the traditional problems of philosophy can appear worse than the original difficulties, or aporia, left by thinkers like Wittgenstein. If we completely abandon the idea that language serves, at least in part, the function of representing reality, it seems to create a whole new set of complex issues, making the cure potentially more problematic than the disease. In discussing the nature of our understanding, particularly in the Northern context, it is evident that there exists a certain naive attachment to traditional vocabulary. This attachment is part of a broader initiative aimed at challenging our preconceived notions and encouraging us to let go of outdated ideas. Personally, I tend to be more conservative and prefer to hold onto these concepts. One of the strategies employed to gently persuade us towards his perspective is the insistence that if we still care about truth and objectivity, we are engaging in a line of reasoning that has been prevalent since the time of Berkeley. This argument is often wielded by anti-realists or idealists against those who lean towards realism. They assert that realists are attempting to position themselves from an Archimedean point, an external vantage point that supposedly allows them to evaluate how well their theories correspond with reality. Rorty effectively uses this critique, and he is indeed correct in his assessment. However, a more intriguing aspect of his argument is the notion that one would only resist his proposal to replace discussions of truth with discussions of solidarity if one harbors a fantastical belief about the world. This belief suggests that the world itself demands to be described in specific terms, as if realists are clinging to a naive idea of a world that possesses its own privileged vocabulary or discourse. This concern is closely linked to a skepticism towards scientism, as those who envision the world as having a privileged voice often equate it with the language of mathematics or physics. Rorty may be tapping into the sentiment that various discourses have their own validity. At first glance, this perspective seems peculiar. It implies that one could wholeheartedly believe in the concept of truth without subscribing to the idea of a talking world. If my interest lies in truth as defined by minimalism, I am focused on the schema that states I believe P if and only if P holds true. My goal is to maximize the instances where this schema is satisfied while minimizing the occasions where I contradict it. This approach does not necessitate a belief in a world that speaks. Rather, it requires the ability to make informed judgments about specific issues at particular times, such as whether penguins can fly, whether geese lay eggs, or whether platypuses are classified as mammals. This line of reasoning does not demand a belief in a communicative world, it simply requires sound judgment. I believe this perspective is valid. There are additional currents influencing Rorty's thoughts, some of which I cannot delve into today. One significant influence is the Celesian distinction between the realm of causes and the realm of reasons. Rorty, along with thinkers like Brandom and McDowell, takes this distinction seriously. They argue that those who believe in truth and objectivity are often trapped in a simplistic view of a world that speaks, which is rooted in the Celesian separation of causes from reasons. This separation shapes their interactions with the world, leading to a purely transactional understanding. Let's delve into the concept of how our minds process information. Essentially, what we perceive can be likened to energies emanating from a constant flux of external stimuli. Our minds then take these raw inputs and actively shape them into our lived experiences. This process encompasses the formation of perceptions, the making of judgments, and a whole host of other cognitive activities. However, this mental processing doesn't occur in a vacuum. It takes us into what philosophers call the space of reasons. Now, it's crucial to understand that this space of reasons is entirely distinct from the space of causes. These are two separate domains, and we shouldn't conflate them. To illustrate this point, let's consider a traditional view of epistemology, the study of knowledge, which Richard Rorty, a prominent philosopher, is striving to move us away from. In this older perspective, it's almost as if photons or other forms of energy from the world arrive carrying specific messages. Imagine them saying, "There's a cat sitting on the mat," or "Beware, there's a steep cliff ahead." This is how the mind, according to the old view, would directly interpret sensory input. But, as Rorty and others like Davidson, a philosopher from the Celesian tradition, argue, that's not how it actually works. These energies don't come pre-packaged with such explicit messages. This is a truly insightful philosophical position, and I believe Rorty has explored it with considerable skill. It's worth noting that this line of thinking has connections to similar ideas presented by philosophers like Robert Brandom and John McDowell, although McDowell's position is perhaps a bit more nuanced and harder to categorize. When Davidson asserts that only a belief can justify another belief, he's essentially operating within the same conceptual framework as Rorty, although Davidson doesn't take his ideas to the same radical conclusions. So, how can we better grasp these concepts and resolve the tension I've mentioned? The tension arises because we might find ourselves agreeing with Rorty when we consider the challenges of traditional epistemology, as highlighted by philosophers like Quinn, Cripp, and Goodman. These thinkers have shown just how difficult it is to establish a firm foundation for knowledge. However, we might not be as sympathetic to Rorty's views if we turn our attention to minimalism. Minimalism, in this context, keeps us grounded in everyday reality. It allows us to interpret statements like "he loves truth with all his heart and soul" not as grand, transcendent pronouncements that require stepping outside of our own being, but as ordinary, verifiable, and empirical observations about a person's commitment to seeking truth according to a specific schema. Now, some attempts to critique Rorty, I believe, miss the mark. It's genuinely challenging to find a critique that truly engages with his ideas effectively. Part of the difficulty lies in Rorty's dialectical approach. He has, in a sense, positioned himself advantageously by arguing that virtually any criticism leveled against him simply demonstrates an adherence to an outdated and simplistic vocabulary. His overarching goal is to encourage us to abandon that old way of thinking altogether. It's a bit like what the philosopher David Lewis once said about not being able to refute an incredulous stare. Similarly, it's hard to argue with someone who simply walks away, turning their back on you. So, while it's a tough task, I do think we can identify some potential flaws in Rorty's reasoning. Let's now shift our focus to the Davidsonian aspect of this discussion, specifically the idea that only a belief can justify another belief, and the notion that there must be a complete separation between the space of causes and the space of reasons. It seems to me that the problem with this Davidsonian slogan, which I'll connect back to Rorty in a moment, is that it's simply not accurate to claim that only a belief can justify another belief. For example, if you were to ask me why I hold a particular belief, I might offer evidence that is not itself a belief but rather a fact or an observation. When I say that I have good reason to believe there's butter in the fridge, my justification typically involves concrete evidence. For example, I might tell you that I personally checked and saw the butter, or I relied on someone else's direct observation, or perhaps there's a camera monitoring the fridge and I can show you the butter in real time. These are the sorts of responses you'd expect to hear in everyday situations. What you won't hear me say is that my justification relies solely on my belief that there's both butter and cheese in the fridge, and that, in my society, it's standard to infer from that combination that butter must be present. Justification, as commonly understood, isn't just about drawing logical conclusions from other beliefs you hold. Imagine a mind that generates beliefs all on its own, without any connection to the outside world, a kind of self-contained mind overflowing with spontaneous ideas. Even if such a mind endlessly produced beliefs, those wouldn't be justified in any meaningful way, at least not in relation to real-world facts. There would be no procedures or methods making it more probable that the belief matches reality. Justification depends on processes that increase the likelihood that you believe something precisely when it's true, and not otherwise. Philosophers like Davidson, expanding on Sellis' ideas, sometimes overlook this crucial distinction. They may forget that the causes behind our beliefs aren't something mystical or separate from our belief system. In fact, it's a basic part of our daily understanding that seeing butter in the fridge causes us to believe it's there. Moreover, knowing these causal relationships lets us intentionally seek out the right experiences to form accurate beliefs. Our beliefs become attuned and responsive to the actual world. This responsiveness is essential to the notion of representation. Unfortunately, thinkers like Rorty, Sellis, and Davidson may have ended up in a situation similar to Berkeley's, when he broke away from Locke's epistemology. They suggest that if you reject Locke's idea that our ideas must resemble reality, your only other choice is to remain trapped within your own thoughts and let the external world slip from view. I want to argue for a more grounded, approachable understanding, one that brings causation and real-world responsiveness back into the picture when explaining how we form beliefs. This approach is much less abstract and more aligned with how people actually operate. If we consider the practicalities of how language and belief work, I think it becomes clear that Rorty overstates his case. Those of us who believe in truth or representation don't typically think the world insists on being described in one particular way. While we might give preference to fields like physics, our reasons for doing so come from practical or explanatory considerations, not from some absolute demand by the world itself. When considering the utility of a concept or its fundamental role in explaining other things, it's essential to separate this idea from the notion that physics is the language of God or the world. You might have this thought, but it's not a necessary assumption. To illustrate this point, let's take a map of a landscape as an example. I want to convince you of the representational credentials of this map, so I'll say, look, here's the sign representing cliffs, and you better pay attention to it. For instance, if you don't, you might fall over the cliffs if you're setting your compass bearing along that path and walking in that direction. The map has a clear use and utility, and I'm all in favor of utility. However, where's the contrast between coping and copying? Where's the distinction between the map enabling you to cope with the landscape and the map representing the landscape? There's no contrast at all. The map does both things. Furthermore, human common sense, not anything transcendental or requiring you to stand on your own shoulders, enables you to relate these two aspects. The map allows you to cope because it represents the lay of the land. If it didn't represent the lay of the land, it would be a miracle that it enables you to cope. The map says, there will be cliffs at point X if and only if the map says that there are cliffs at point X. That's what it means for the map to be a good representation. You'll cope better by expecting cliffs at point X if you use the map than if you form a belief about the presence or absence of cliffs in a random way. The map increases your chances of getting it right. These might seem like harmless platitudes about the representational properties of a map, but I think they can be generalized to the representational properties of language in general. They tie the notion of representation to that of explanation, partly to that of response, as in causal cases, but partly to that of representation. One way to cement this relationship, and it's just one of many, is to adopt a success semantics approach, as presented by Frank Ramsey, the great early 20th century Cambridge philosopher. The idea is that you can certify the representational power of a piece of vocabulary or a symbol on a map if you can say that there's a conventional habit of acting upon it, either in a single person or in a society, and the explanation of the success of people who act upon it is that it corresponds to whatever is represented. Let me give an example. Suppose the map has a little symbol of a church at a certain point, and I say that symbol represents a church in a village like Little Gidding. The idea behind success semantics is that the representational property of that symbol on the map is certified or analyzed into the idea that people acting upon that representation, people acting upon the fact of that symbol being at that place on the map, are typically successful. This approach highlights the connection between representation, explanation, and successful action, demonstrating that the utility of a concept or a map is deeply tied to its representational credentials. When considering the actions of individuals within a church community, it's common to attribute their success to certain aspects of their environment. This perspective suggests that the church's role is symbolically significant, marking a space that fosters success. Such ideas are rich with implications and can be explored through various lenses, including evolutionary adaptation or without such a framework. They don't necessarily require a teleological explanation, but can certainly fit within one. Today, I aim to highlight that this view offers a natural and non-transcendental way to bridge the gap between causality and rationality. It sees concepts and reasoning as deeply intertwined with our physical existence and actions within the world. This integration is often overlooked in postmodern discussions. For instance, Vincent's approach might have faltered by focusing on the abstract question of what justifies belief. Instead, a more practical approach would be to examine each belief individually and consider what justifies it in specific contexts. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to this question. Justification is always relative to the belief in question and our embodied experience. This perspective aligns with some of John McDowell's ideas in Mind and World, though I believe his execution has some flaws. This brings us to the postmodern mantra popularized by Jacques Derrida: there is nothing outside the text. Interestingly, this idea can be traced back to Wittgenstein, who emphasized the importance of our actions in the world as a means to overcome the mind-world dualism that has plagued philosophy. However, adopting this view doesn't simplify epistemology or allow us to dismiss the insights of philosophers like Selous, Quinn, or Wittgenstein entirely. It also doesn't shield us from recognizing the potential for unseen forces at play in moral, social, and political contexts, which is often a valid concern. In essence, understanding the role of the Church and its symbolic significance requires us to consider how our beliefs and actions are deeply rooted in our physical and social environments. This perspective offers a nuanced way to navigate the complex interplay between reason and causality in our lives. I don't want to come across as overly positive, especially when it comes to the concept James referred to as the human serpent. I believe it truly warrants such a description. However, I am hopeful about the potential for a philosophy that re-establishes the connection between truth, mind, and the world. This philosophy would allow us to move beyond the confines of postmodernist skepticism, enabling us to discuss truth, reality, objectivity, reason, and experience without feeling embarrassed. We could even delve into the topic of foundations, though I think that would be a subject for another discussion. Thank you very much.